Nasiruddin Muhammad Humayun, India's second Mughal emperor. A man known to be kind and considerate to his subjects. A ruler who patronized art as a soft power to his rule. It's no surprise that today he is identified with this beautiful edifice called Humayun's Tomb. Built in his name, this elevated mausoleum is a shining example of a rich legacy carried forward by his successors. The monument which stands tall as an inspiration for the wonder of the world. A story of intent and testament of its creator's brilliance. This grand structure has witnessed a glorious rise of an empire and the end of its last ever monarch. One of the major heritage sites in India today, and undoubtedly one of the busiest tourist attractions in Delhi. The tomb glares with perfection, finesse and beauty. Even till this day, the Humayun Tomb has stood out as magnificent testament to the style of early Mughal architecture.
Mughals are quite misunderstood, and they were not the invaders that the Mongols were. Firstly, the Mughals would have liked to call themselves Timurids. The word Mughal really comes from Portuguese and other historians, and they would have liked to call themselves Timurid. But Babur, when he came here, he hated the climate, he hated the weather, he hated the fact that there was not enough running water and so on, because in the hills where he come from Kabul and all that, there were all these channels. But Babur came to stay, and of course he indulged in all sorts of politics to make it. He became the holy warrior and all of that. But the Mughals and the Humayun's tomb itself, it is a great monumental structure because it was a statement from the Mughals. This is who we are and we are here to stay.
Predating several large and ornate buildings commissioned and constructed under the patronage of his son Akbar and great-grandson Shah Jahan, the story of Humayun's tomb, like any other royal mausoleum, begins with the story of an emperor. Son of Babur, the founder of one of the most powerful empires in the history of subcontinent, and father of the greatest Mughal emperor, Akbar. Humayun, a man markedly different from both, has a special place in the history of early Mughals.
What we've realized is that Humayun is very little known. There is the usual, one or two comments, he stumbled in and out of life and all of that. But actually, if you read some of the later Mughal texts, they were actually looking at Humayun as the founder of the dynasty rather than Babur. So a lot of the Mughal chronicles actually refer to Humayun in very respectful terms.
He is kind of squeezed between two great personalities, that of his father, that is Babur, and then of course his son, that is Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar. And I think because of that, for quite some time, Humayun eluded us, and it's difficult to really comment on what his personality is, because the cliche or the stereotype that we know of him is that he's an opium eater and he's a poor general. However, when you look at some of the sources that comment directly on him, we find that there is a different kind of personality over there, and somebody who has been through a lot of vicissitudes in life, and he has still managed to resist opposition in a way that he comes back to reclaim his throne.
He's not a simple person to understand. He's a very complex human being. And what we have to do is understand the fact that there is more to the man, and that's only now that recent research is uncovering. They're looking at the writings, say, of Khandamir and saying, here is a visionary who had an idea of, how should I put it, a cosmopolitan empire. A cosmopolitan empire that was shaped by cosmological influences. So it was actually looking towards the sense of universalism that is usually attributed to Akbar, but was present in the time period of Humayun. So, his greatness or his uniqueness is something which is being excavated and discovered only now.
The only Mughal emperor whose name is written with the laurels of re-establishing the empire after losing it, Humayun also earned the title Insan-e-Kamil, a perfect man among the Mughals. Though he grew up learning statecraft while assisting his father in major battles in the bid to lay the foundation of Mughal empire, his life was full of several twists and hardships. After assuming the throne of empire at the age of 23, Humayun's first line of threat came from his own brothers, Hindal, Kamran and Askari.
We know that Humayun lost his father's patrimony, briefly even, but at least he lost it. So much of what we learn about Humayun is in a sense that he's been a failure. How do you explain that? How do you account for the fact that he managed to recover from failure and so on and so forth? So all of these little details, this retrospective reading of history tends to color it. Humayun, on the other hand, is a really, really interesting chap. I mean, he's quite, if you read his activities during the lifetime of Babur, one of the things that you discover is that he's actually, quite able general. In fact, as far as generals go, not only is he capable, but he's also bloodthirsty. He's capable of killing. He's capable of decisive action. He has all those elements which are a part of the making of the great general.
Humayun was 13 when he became the governor of Badakhshan. And, he was, it's said, was ousted from India by Sher Shah and so on. And it is said that he was in exile. But he never lived in exile as a person in exile. He lived outside as the king or the emperor of Hindustan. So it's amazing that he actually had the persistence, even after being ousted, to really come and recapture the throne and re-establish the Mughal dynasty.
When Humayun succeeds the throne after his father Babur, it's not that he comes to the throne easily, because there are people who are going to pose problems for him. And then finally there is this contest with Sher Shah Sur, and he's expelled from Hindustan. And then actually this entire period of his exile from Hindustan and his seeking refuge with the Shah of Persia, and then coming back to Kabul, acquiring back areas which had been taken away by his brothers, especially Mirza Kamran, and then coming back to Hindustan. This is a phenomenal story.
The challenges grew further 5 years into his rule. It came from the east, it came from the west. Sultan Bahadur of Gujarat and Sher Shah, the governor of Bihar province, posed challenges before his kingdom. While Sultan Bahadur was defeated in the year 1535, it was to be Sher Shah Suri who charted the history as one of the great warriors, defeating Mughals and forcing Humayun in exile outside the boundaries of Hindustan.
it's really hard to figure out who Humayun is. B, much of what we know about Humayun, we know retrospectively. Retrospectively, one, in the context of his failures, or B, in the way in which Akbar wanted his father to be remembered. Sometimes he wanted him to be remembered as this great person, but not too great, so that it would dwarf Akbar. There has to be a balance, very careful balance that was kept. Thirdly, when Akbar wanted Humayun to be remembered, one of the things that he didn't want Humayun to be remembered as is a great warrior, because that would diminish Akbar's abilities. Or let's say a visionary as a monarch, because that would also sort of create an antecedent to Akbar.
I think his struggles were primarily on account of him not putting his brothers, because his father had given him the guidance in writing, in these letters survive, Babur's letters survive, asking Humayun to be kind to his brothers. And he took that to an extreme. And his brothers again and again rebelled, to the extent that one of his brothers put his young infant son Akbar on in front of his army so that they would not be attacked. So I think he was a kind person, far ahead of his times. When his life was saved by a bhishti, a water carrier, he put the water carrier on the throne. Now, far ahead of his times.
Even as the fledgling empire was strung with warfare, Humayun's love for art and architecture was unaffected. 3 years into the rule, in 1533, Humayun laid the foundation of new city, Din-i-Panah, on the historic site of Indraprastha, where Purana Kila stands today. The fort, which is laid with beautifully designed gardens, high walls built upon the remains of earlier indigenous citadel, and structures bearing religious and cultural significance, became the first blueprints of forts and royal mansions to follow.
Humayun's fascination with the architectural monuments which he goes to leisurely visit along with Shah Tahmasp, and also along with his sister Shahzada Begum, who is there to escort him through, because she has been instructed by Shah Tahmasp that Humayun and his family are a special guest, and Hamida Banu Begum is also there, and he tours this, and there is an appreciation for these structures. And then we know that he comes back with the leading artists from the court of Shah Tahmasp. And later there is also a lot of patronage given by his son Akbar. So this is, I think, this strengthens the Persianate component in the Timurid traditions, and this is what we see, the unfolding of which we see later in his son's reign.
He was also a great administrator and an architect. He built some very interesting buildings. Not many of it survive, sadly. But by reading references, and we are able to establish his architectural priorities. He was very, very innovative, and I think a lot of the innovations that he did came about during the beginning of his reign.
I mean, for a long time it was thought that the great studios, the great centers of art came up in Akbar's reign. Shahryar Adil pointed out, when was this? Almost 19 years ago. In an article, he brought out all the details of how Humayun brought with him artists from Herat. And Herat was the cultural capital of the Timurids. And the earliest paintings that come from the Mughal period actually date to Humayun's reign. So of course he was a patron of the arts. He's a patron for the arts. You know also from the kind of writings that Pandamir has given us, that he is a man who is remarkably visionary.
Humayun is not the only Badshah who is doing this. It was the convention of the times. In the medieval times, the Badshahs, the rulers, the sultans were often indulging in astrology, and they were often indulging in reading the horoscopes, to the extent that favorable horoscopes were drafted in order to project the image of the king as a strong ruler.
Described as a superstitious man and an avid stargazer, he reorganized his court, allocating departments as per an elaborate astrological game. The major offices of his ministries were divided into 4 elements. The Earth Department looked after agriculture and architecture. Water Department looked into administration of water bodies like masonries, canals and wine cellars. Fire Department was given charge of military matters, and the Air Department dealt with the issues like wardrobe, kitchen, stables and necessary management of mules and camels.
This is a cosmology which is at work, through which you can talk in terms of patterning of states, through which you can talk in terms of greater conduct of people. Keep in mind, this is in some ways an insight into a future modernity. Akbar in the next generation would take a look and say that if you have to understand human action, it has to be something greater than morality. It has to be something greater than religion. He will say it has to be something more universal, more encompassing. And you talk about ethics. There are ethical modes governing conduct which are bigger than Islam, that bigger than any mazhab. There should be a way to define in absolute terms or in clearly immoral terms what is good and what is wrong. In the same way, cosmology is looking at larger patternings. And indeed, that's where Humayun was going. But we have to understand these.
It was very interesting. You read in Gulbadan Begum and Humayun Nama some very interesting references. For example, he was the one who introduced circular seating. The hierarchy that Shah Jahan later established with himself in the Qibla and everybody in front. Humayun was much more of an inclusive person, and he introduced seating, that people were sitting in a round table rather than in a formal way. But also he sort of said, you're the Department of Air, Water, Fire and Earth. It's like the zodiac signs.
He was responsible for creating 2 special kinds of tents. And one tent was called Mihr-e-Azim, and this is a tent in which the emperor sat, and there were 12 different segments which were created in the tent, and these segments were representing the 12 signs of the zodiac, with lattices on the walls so that the sunlight could be filtered in. And then the position of the King Humayun was such that it appeared as if the entire arrangement was with the king in the center like the sun, and the other planets, that is his amirs and notables. Incidentally, his administration was also divided into 12 departments, and this shows the depth and the conceptualization. This is how he was conceiving of himself, as the Sun Emperor, maybe, if you like.
But it was an irony that a man who gazed at twilight sky and stars to chart his moves died studying it. On one winter evening of January 1556, he tumbled down the staircase of Syed Mandal, which he used as an observatory. In what could be possibly said as an expression of deep love of a wife towards a dead husband, the idea of a splendid mausoleum was expressed by Hamida Banu Begum, Humayun's Persian wife. The building of tomb began in the year 1565 under the patronage of his son Akbar, and the tomb was completed in the year 1572.
It's all well recorded of how it was built and so on. There is a general belief that his widow Hamida Banu Begum built it, but she was on Hajj when it started to be built. So by the time she returned from Hajj, the tomb was mostly built. So she was really given responsibility for the maintenance, for the care of the craftsmen who were working there. But it is incorrectly believed that she was in charge of building. The building was really Akbar. It was his first great building of building construction project after he consolidated his throne.
Hamida Banu Begum is usually ascribed as somehow being in charge of this. She wasn't. The people who were in charge, the people who were actually the architects and looking after managing it, were Iranians. I forget their names right now, but yeah, there were a couple of people that were involved in this, and this is in the early years of Akbar's reign that the command for the construction of Humayun's tomb was made.
The history of early Mughals is replete with warfare, court intrigues, losses and conquests. Very less is known about Mughal ladies. It's here Hamida Banu deserves a special mention.
Hamida was very young. She was barely 14 years of age, and Humayun was 33 when this alliance took place between the two of them. And Hamida was resisting it. It was Humayun who seemed to be very persistent, and through the offices of Dildar Begum, who is the mother of Gulbadan and Hindal, and it is through the offices of Dildar Begum that Humayun persuades Dildar Begum that he would like to have an alliance with Hamida, and Hamida is actually not interested. We are told by Gulbadan that she categorically says that she has already been presented once before the emperor and would not like to meet him again.
In exile, and in one of the toughest times for the emperor who had lost everything, Humayun drew immense support from Bairam Khan, his most trusted aide, and Hamida Banu. Hamida travelled extensively with the exiled emperor, even to the rough terrains, which needed her to be battle-hardened.
When Babur was moving around and everything was still off horseback, because the structures of control, because the structures of the kingdom were not so, how shall I put it, so overt, women had a greater role to play. As we move into Akbar's reign, that's when you have the first makings of the harem. As we move into Akbar's reign and we have the first making of the harem, that's when the women start becoming anonymous. Hamida Banu is of an earlier generation, before we have the making of the state. Actually, Hamida Banu Begum is a part of the process by which Akbar starts creating the structures which will consolidate his authority.
The women were always were not so prominently talked about, although they did play a very, very significant role in Timurid politics. And this is evident to us from the way the women are constantly moving with the king. The harem is constantly moving with the king, whether he's on battle, whether he's going for a hunt, whether he's going for travel, for pleasure. We find that the harem plays a very significant role. Not just as far as travel is concerned, but we also see women are very active in patronizing art, literature, architecture. Some of them are fine scholars. They are often writing poetry. We come to know about their poetic ventures also. So these are ladies who have been well brought up. Often these matrimonial associations were well thought of.
And it was in exile they took refuge in Umarkot, a Rajput kingdom ruled by Rana Prasad, where Hamida gave birth to their son Jalaluddin Muhammad on 15th October 1542. The future emperor who shone like a star, and his greatness remains unparalleled in the history of Mughals. World knows him better as Akbar. 9 years after Humayun's death, in the reign of Akbar, the construction began of what was to be the largest mausoleum in Delhi of any ruler ever. In terms of scale, the Humayun's tomb outsized earlier Indo-Islamic-style mausoleum of rulers and royal hires scattered across the capital, the old seat of Sultanate and succeeding League of Rulers. Mainly Sultangadi tomb, an earlier 20th century structure dating to Sultanate era, the tomb of Giyathuddin Tughlaq at Tughlaqabad built in the year 1325, tombs of Syed and Lodi era, and the tomb of Sher Shah Suri's chosen noble Isa Khan Niazi, which was built in the year 1547. The proximity of Isa Khan Niazi's tomb to Humayun's draws a significance, a rare instance in the medieval era where an old enemy's chosen noble lay buried in close proximity to an emperor. The beautiful mausoleum, built in 8 octagon Lodi architectural style, is highlighted with its glazed tiled canopies and arches. And a 16th century sandstone mosque which stands opposite to the tomb at the outermost walls of the Humayun's tomb.
What you should do is perhaps compare Humayun's tomb and Tughlaqabad and say, all right, I can understand Tughlaqabad. Amount of people, personal, money, resources that went into the making of a fort. Humayun's tomb, it's a tomb, for God's sakes. So much money, so much resources spent towards that tomb. That gives you a sense of how a tomb is actually being understood differently at a certain juncture than in a preceding one. Compare Sayyid tombs with Humayun's tomb, and you will then understand that people are actually ready to say, for a certain kind of a public statement, spend money. It's as important as spending money on a fort. That's the difference. That there is something to be made about the spectacle of the royal mausoleum. That Mughals have got down.
To build a grand mausoleum of his father, Akbar chose Miragh Mirza Ghias, an architect of Iranian descent, whose extensive works in Herat and Bukhara had earned him various laurels and a title of Ustad. Little did he know that he was about to craft a new dimension to Indo-Islamic architecture and royal buildings of the subcontinent.
These are craftsmen, and master craftsman was probably brought in, somebody who Humayun knew, somebody whose family had earlier worked for Babur. So the ideas that Humayun had placed were actually used by Akbar to build this building on this monumental scale. Nothing has been built anywhere in the Islamic world that is anywhere close to what Humayun's tomb is. It's a totally new innovation. And they're using a lot of local elements.
Humayun's tomb is, let's say, the more grandiose statement of smaller timbered structures that had come up. So there's the Sabz Burj, for example, which has some parts of the drum and some parts of the dome which you find in Humayun's tomb. You realize this is harkening back to Samarkand, the Gur-e-Mir, where Amir Timur's tomb is located. And that is, in some senses, how should you say, the prototype. But my God, 100 times bigger, far more resplendent, and then noticeably very different from anything that had existed before on that scale. So look, it's interesting that in a necropolis where there are so many other mausolea, then you have something of the size, the ambition, the different stylistic difference as Humayun's tomb. You're making a huge statement regarding the making of a new world order.
The location of tomb draws a great spiritual significance too. It lies at the extension of Din-i-Panah, the citadel built by Humayun, and Dargah of Hazrat Nizamuddin Aulia, a 14th century mystic who left a legacy of spiritual order called Sufism. The order that even mighty rulers acknowledged has grown many folds today, propagating peace, learning, and humanity. Since the older times, it was considered auspicious to be buried near the grave of a saint.
This area is important for several different reasons. A, this is Nizamuddin Aulia. It's a necropolis. But you see, the mistake that we make sometimes is we keep thinking only of Nizamuddin Aulia. This is not just Nizamuddin Aulia, but perhaps thanks to Nizamuddin Aulia, this is a sacred place for Sufis. Even before Nizamuddin Aulia, Sufis wanted to live around this place, this this neighborhood called Indrapath. Indrapath was the place where peasants would stay, where Sufis would stay, where all those that were running away from the state would stay. Later on, this is a place which was then made sacred by the Sayyids. Sayyids are buried in a place called Khairpur, Lodi Gardens. But the Sayyids are descendants of the Prophet. So this entire area, that area was known as Aliganj later on. It's associated with the family of Ali.
When the Mughals finally defeated the Lodhis and established control over Delhi, Babur does not go straight to the treasury. He first goes to the Dargah of Hazrat Nizamuddin Auliya. So the respect for the saint, for the Chishtiya order, was there from much before that they came here. And that respect continues all the way, through the Mughal Empire. Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last Mughal emperor, took refuge here, is arrested. 5 of the last Mughal emperors are buried at Humayun's tomb. So the Mughals' associations with the Dargah continues all 300 years of the dynasty.
So that entire precinct has a sacred order attached to it. It's also the place where the competitors of the early Mughals were located. And there are 2 types of competitors. One is, of course, the Lodhis, the Afghans. The Sayyids and the Afghans are buried there. They're dispersed. They've had a location there for a very long period of time. But also other Amirzadas, other competitors of Humayun are also in that neighborhood. So this is a place occupied by the likes of Mahamanga, who will go on and make, this huge Khair al-Manazil. This is a space which has also been associated with Sher Shah. So it's a place where over the last 200 years, there's been a great deal of politics, a great deal of turbulence. What better place to stick your flag?
The first ever mausoleum of any Mughal emperor, the place soon emerged as a spot to pay obeisance towards the empire, an expression of respect.
It's a tradition that Humayun had started and which the Mughals continued. Humayun had built the tomb of his father, and Akbar built the tomb of his father, Jahangir built the tomb of Akbar, and so on. So Shah Jahan, the only one who built a tomb for his wife and then later buried, but he also built Jahangir's tomb, and so that tradition continued.
The grandeur of the tomb can be trifurcated in its plinth, the main chamber, and the glorious dome. It's this huge dome, standing 42.5 meters high, which easily forms a sight to behold even from a far distance. The tomb is the first Indian structure to have double dome engineering. The 2-layered concept of crowning important royal buildings, which was common in Central and West Asia by early 16th century. While the inner side covered the interior chamber, the outer layer gave it height and grandeur. The dome also lent cushion and balance to the chamber and structural strength with a large plinth under it. The method was used in several other grand buildings of the Mughals, Rajputs and the later Sikh era.
I don't think Sabz Burj has double dome. This is perhaps one of the earliest double domes. If I remember right, this is one of the earliest double domes. But altogether, the point is really of scale. Nothing quite this size has been made. In the Deccan, you have huge domes. You have very large structures, right? But amongst historians, we always take a look and say Lodhis and Syed and so on and so forth. We don't compare it to what's happening in Bijapur, right? Or Golconda. Take a look at those places. The size of structures there, that's what the Mughals need to be compared to.
The marble-clad double dome is flanked by pillared kiosks or chhatris, inspired by Rajputana style, and canopies on four sides adorned with glazed ceramic tiles, a trademark West Asian art to beautify buildings.
It was the first ever project which is being done privately by the Aga Khan Trust for Culture in India, by any private agency. So it was a huge responsibility. And what we at the Aga Khan Trust for Culture have tried to establish is a model conservation philosophy. And that really is based on craft, building craft. Now in India, handicraft, handloom has all got support, but the building craft does not. So we've had stone carvers, carpenters, masons working with lime, plasterers, all of these people who can still work with the same tools, same building techniques as their forefathers did about 5 centuries ago. We've had a great deal of supervision, so architects, engineers have been involved, and material scientists and geologists and all sorts of people. But essentially the only craft that was lost to India was tile making. So we had to get a master craftsman from Uzbekistan, train local people and revive that craft.
Another feature of the dome is its magnificent copper finial, atop with calligraphic brass plate. It was for the first time that a finial, so very integral part of temples and Rajputana structures, was used in any Indo-Islamic style building.
It's an incredible building with a combination of so many elements that have never been used before. The finial has been used in Mughal buildings, but it's not copper, it's mostly stone. We found ceramic finials. So, here the Taj Mahal, possibly Rahim's tomb, also had a copper finial. The word that the Mughals used for the finial is a kalash, which is the word we use for a finial of a temple. So it's clear where they're picking it up from and using it.
In the year 2014, this 18 feet ornamental ensemble was knocked by a massive storm in the capital. Nearly 2 years later, the finial was reinstalled by Aga Khan Trust for Culture after carrying an elaborate research and groundwork.
The Archaeological Survey of India, the Aga Khan Trust for Culture and the Tara Trust. So 3 important agencies working towards making sure the building got the best that it could have got. The finial, when it collapsed, we got support from Titan to really build a replica finial. But it is incredible that in the 16th century, the Mughals used copper of 99.6% purity. It's copper that is not even commercially available today. So it tells you the metallurgical skills of Indians in the 16th century. And then gold, it's taken 5 kilos of 24 karat gold. And the finial sits 40 meters in the sky and is itself 6 meters tall. So by far it was one of the most challenging things we've done. And again, an ode to our craftsmen, to our engineers, who were able to, put together an extremely dangerous job.
Conservation through the years has now once again restored Humayun Tomb to its past glory.
When the British took over, the craftsmen were replaced by engineers and architects. And the moment that happened, people forgot how to work with buildings. So we removed 1 million kilos of concrete from the roof of Humayun's tomb. So through the 20th century, inappropriate works, we removed 200,000 square feet of cement. So in the 20th century, modern materials were inappropriately used, accelerating decay, accelerating damage. A lot of vandalism took place when this was a refugee camp in 1947. The doors were burnt and all of that. So what we've been able to do is go back to the original builder's intention. We've been able to put the tiles back. We've been able to remove thousands of kilos of concrete. We've been able to restore lime plaster.
The red sandstone structure is essentially square in shape, but its designer and architect Biraq Mirza Qiyas used chamfered angles to give it a distinct octagonal shape, with each its side having an arched recess ornate in style, and flanked with beautiful lattice work on the edges. It is the southern recess which gives entry inside the mausoleum, housing the cenotaph of Emperor Humayun under a beautiful dome, once said to be gilded with gold and surrounded by beautiful lattice screens, where sunlight breaks on the floor to make it even more pious. But it's not here. The second Mughal emperor rests in peace. The original grave is in the basement under the plinth. Such was the usual practice during Mughal era to build a cenotaph at a high pedestal in order to safeguard the real grave from the invaders and enemies.
The plan of the mausoleum is also very interesting. It is raised, actually it has 3 stories. First of all, it is raised on a high plinth. Then we have the structure, the real graves are going to be under this plinth, yes. And then we have another mound, the second story, on which we are going to witness high steps, and the third structure is going to be that of the mausolea, which actually is the cenotaph, because the real grave is at the bottom.
Hamida Bano, 2 lies buried here. In what could be a full circle of a beautiful love story of 2 souls who stood next to each other in rule, in exile, and in death. Several other cenotaphs of members of Mughal royal family and nobles are housed in this tomb. Prominent among them being Dara Shikoh, son of Shah Jahan and half-brother of 6th Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb. In those days, it was considered pious to be buried in the proximity of a great ruler's resting place. But what has made Humayun Tomb even more imposing and majestic in its scale is this large plinth with 64 arched cells. A picture of symmetry, this plinth far outsides the raised platforms of earlier significant buildings in the subcontinent. These are some of the structural nuances of architecture which were later improved upon while building grand structures in later Mughal era.
When we look at the ground plan of the design, it is very complex, because the central chamber that you have for Humayun's grave is actually also having certain adjuncts which open into subsidiary 4 chambers. So this is a very complex plan, and technically it may be called the Hasht Bihisht or the 8-fold plan, actually, which becomes the 9-fold, because at the center you have another structure there. So this is technically very sound.
Another feature of tomb complex is its elaborate garden and waterworks. A starting point of the Mughal architecture in India and style in amalgam of Persian, Turkish and Indian architectural influences. The gardens around the tomb are inspired by Charbagh or Charbagh concept of Islam.
Humayun's tomb is the first case of a literal Charbagh being used. Now the Mughals used the word Charbagh in a very, it was not a proper sense. Any garden with raised walkways was called a Charbagh. I mean, the walkways could be like this, but this is the first time that is used. And the 4 quadrants divide and the Charbagh comes from the 4 rivers of paradise as described in the Holy Quran. But over here, that literal Charbagh is taken to another extent, with each one of these 4 quadrants further divided into 8 plots, which represents the Hasht Bihisht or the 8 gateways to paradise. So Akbar took no chances. He made sure his father was in heavenly paradise.
The Charbaghs keep changing. What is true is that, in a sense, this is a classic Charbagh. Classic, very elaborate Charbagh, a garden broken up into 4 parts, then subdivided into further parts, with the center, as it were, paradise, which is Humayun's tomb. Now, this is a classic Charbagh. So, it's not the first time you see it. It's been made before by Babur, who talks about it. There are paintings, miniatures of Babur making Charbaghs, right? They may not have survived, or if they do exist, they exist in smaller sizes.
The garden is divided into 4 squares running around the tomb by water channels. Highlighting an example of elaborate waterworks, a small pool was laid on all 4 sides of the tomb, crossing the channels and water masonry at the far end. Each large square block is divided into 8 smaller symmetrical chambers, while the water channels forms a cross-section around the tomb.
It is very evident that there is an intermixture of the Timurid and the Persianate traditions very strongly which comes across here. And there are certain stylistic features. For example, the location of the mausoleum in the design of a garden. Now this garden is also of a peculiar kind, a specific kind of a garden which we call the Charbagh or the Charbagh, which means that the garden plan is actually divided into quarters, into 4 quarters, and the quarters are further divided into significant squares, and the pathways are created. Pathways called khiyaban are created so that you can walk along these paths. And most significantly, the first instance when the garden is cut into 4 quarters is actually also going to be the space for the channels, water channels to flow, which is actually imitating the imagery of the paradise as described in the Quran.
If you follow all of this stuff, all of these writings, you'll understand that this is not novel. It appears novel because of its size. It appears novel because of the grand setting in which it's been cast. That hadn't happened. And it'll be picked up. Thereafter the Mughals play with it. They're great innovators. They never repeat it. Or they repeat it, but they also adapt it. Shah Jahan did things to Charbagh which were amazing.
These waterworks led to an establishment of style that is seen in later Indo-Islamic architecture, where Nahr-e-Bihisht is not just an ornamental addition to the structure, but a greater cultural symbolism with the edifice.
Suffice it to say that whenever you visit a structure like the mausolea, or whenever you go to a mosque, there is a water body, because it is quintessential to have it there for ablutions. And even in the case of a mausoleum, even in the case of a tomb, it is not just meant for visiting the dead. If it is a time appropriate for prayer, one would immediately do the ablution and perform the prayer in the mausoleum itself, because the indication of the mihrab is there, the indication of the qibla wall is identified easily, and people would use that space to perform the prayer.
In the days to come, the tomb complex grew further in its importance. A place identified with flurry of activities and assembly for piety. Among the string of smaller structures which dots the mausoleum today, Arab Ki Sarai, a 16th century caravanserai, was built by Humayun's other widow, Haji Begum. As per one version, Haji Begum built the sarai to shelter priests who accompanied her during Hajj to Makkah, while other version mentions the building was built for Persian craftsmen and workers who had built the Humayun's tomb.
We know later that there is also evidence of a bazaar which was constructed within the Arab Ki Sarai, and if it is a sarai, if it's an inn, then travelers are coming in. We know that initially perhaps it was constructed in order to house the huffaz, that is people who are going to recite the Quran and pray for the dead emperor. So they were housed here, and the story goes that there were about 200 Arab huffaz who had been invited and who were housed in this area. Later we see that it is turning into a caravanserai. If you enter the structure, you see that the dome is missing now, and then of course there are places where one could tie the horses and rest for the night.
Another major site around the tomb complex is Sunder Nursery, a 16th century beautiful park that is today a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Originally known as Azim Bagh, the garden houses several Mughal and later era monuments. It's said that the British named it Sunder based on its breathtaking beauty and large expanse, which combined the facets of Persian concept of ornate garden and the British way of lawns to walk around. A first of its own kind grand structure also laid the architectural foundation of the wonder of the world, the Taj Mahal, built by his great-grandson Shah Jahan. A mausoleum, mark of love, the crown of the palaces, Taj Mahal also signified the height of Mughal Empire.
This is evident in the style in which the two monuments have been constructed, the plinth, then the octagonal structure, though the Taj is significantly different from Humayun's Maqbara, but then we have this characteristic dome. Of course, the minarets are something which are a later design during Shah Jahan's period. So we really don't have the minarets here, but you know, the use of several other Timurid architectural features, such as you know, the high gateway. This is something, the pishtaq. These kind of traditions continue even during the constructions undertaken by Shah Jahan, and especially at the Taj.
But this great edifice, which witnessed the ascent of an empire, was also witness to its end. Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last Mughal emperor and the descendant of Timurid dynasty, was arrested by British officer William Hodson from his safe house here after the suppression of 1857 rebellion. Proclaimed as an emperor of Hindustan by mutineers, Bahadur Shah Zafar was sent to exile by the British, and unlike Humayun, this Mughal could never come back to rule.
I can take a look at Humayun's tomb and think about the processes that have actually led to the making of me. What is the processes that are involved? I should start thinking about how I am not just the descendant of my father and my grandfather, but as a descendant of my father and grandfather, I also question them, learning from my uncles and aunts maybe, or my distant relatives, or my servants in my house. I learned from all of them. They're a part of my family, right? But as you know, I have to understand the complex things that constitute me. The more I understand about complex things that constitute me, the greater the circle that constitutes me gets to be. As I take it great, as I make that greater, I understand the processes that make me. That's what Humayun's tomb can do.
As you enter into the structure, on your right side, we witness a very interesting Afghan mausoleum, that of Isa Khan Niazi. Then on the left, we have Bu Halima's tomb, which is of course in ruins now, but we pass through her garden, we enter into a walled enclosure, and then walk on towards the tomb of Humayun. And even before we reach that tomb, once again on the right hand side, we have the Arab ki Sarai, and we are curious to explore that area. So walking through this complex, you know, gives us a tremendous sense of history.
The Humayun's tomb really uses Akbar's ideas of religion, of equality, of becoming Indian. So they're taking up elements from all of this architecture, and the statement is grandeur. It's a statement that, you know, of power, of architecture, of local material, of respect for Humayun. And that respect continues. So Akbar made 10 visits to Humayun's tomb. Shah Jahan, Jahangir, all of them made repeated visits and gave their respects at the tomb.